Private jets aren't for people like you. The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp enough to turn heads and cold enough to make an entire terminal fall silent. For a brief moment, even the distant hum of aircraft engines seemed to fade beneath the weight of what had just been said. It was 6:40 on a gray Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Rain tapped softly against the massive glass walls overlooking the private aviation terminal, streaking the view of sleek jets parked on the tarmac. Inside, everything looked polished and expensive. Marble floors reflected the glow of recessed lights. Executives in tailored suits moved quietly between lounges. Flight crews checked schedules on tablets while luxury SUVs pulled up outside beneath a covered entrance. It was the kind of place where status spoke before people did. Ava Montgomery stepped through the sliding doors carrying a small leather travel bag and a black coat draped neatly over one arm. At 38, she carried herself with a calm confidence that came from years of building something people said she never could. She wore no flashy jewelry, no designer logos, no visible signs of wealth. Just simple elegance and the quiet focus of someone with a destination in mind. Most people barely noticed her, but one person did. Officer Ryan Keller stood near the security checkpoint, watching the flow of travelers entering the private terminal. Tall, broad-shouldered, and proud of the authority attached to the badge on his chest, Ryan considered himself the gatekeeper of the space. He believed he could read people within seconds. At least, that was what he told himself. As Ava approached the private access corridor, Ryan stepped directly into her path. His expression tightened. His eyes moved from her face to her bag and back again. "Ma'am," he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "I think you're headed the wrong way." Ava stopped. "Excuse me. The commercial terminals are on the other side of the airport." A few nearby travelers slowed their pace. Not enough to stare openly, but enough to listen. Ava glanced toward the corridor entrance and then back at Ryan. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Ryan let out a short laugh. "This area is restricted to authorized private passengers." Ava remained calm. "I am an authorized passenger." Something about her composure seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. He folded his arms and looked around as though inviting others to agree with him. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound patronizing. "Let's save ourselves some trouble. Private jets aren't for people like you." The terminal grew noticeably quieter. Several travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ava said nothing. She simply looked at him for a long second, her expression unreadable. Then she shifted her gaze past him, through the towering windows overlooking the rain-soaked runway, where one gleaming white jet sat waiting in the distance. And somewhere beyond the glass, events had already begun moving in a direction Officer Ryan Keller could never have imagined. Ava continued looking through the rain-speckled glass as though the conversation behind her no longer existed. The jet resting on the runway remained motionless, its white fuselage gleaming beneath the overcast morning sky. Inside the terminal, however, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations that had once drifted quietly through the lounge had faded into uneasy silence. People were listening now. Ryan Keller noticed it too. He could feel eyes settling on him from every direction, but instead of stepping back, he leaned further into the role he believed belonged to him. Authority had always felt comfortable when nobody challenged it. "Ma'am, I am going to need identification," he said firmly. Ava slowly turned her attention back toward him. Her expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm. She did not appear angry. She did not appear intimidated. If anything, she looked mildly disappointed. "You already know my destination," she replied. "You already know I have authorization. What exactly are you trying to prove?" Ryan tightened his jaw. "I am trying to keep this facility secure." Ava nodded once. Security is important. The simplicity of her answer seemed to frustrate him even more. Nearby, a businessman seated near the lounge entrance lowered his newspaper. A woman carrying a laptop paused halfway through a phone call. Even a pair of flight attendants standing near the concierge desk exchanged uncertain glances. The scene had become impossible to ignore. Ryan extended his hand. "Identification." Ava reached into her coat pocket. For a moment Ryan appeared satisfied, convinced that control was returning to the situation. But instead of handing over a license, Ava retrieved her phone. She tapped the screen once and sent a brief message. Nothing more. No explanation. No argument. Just a single text. Ryan laughed quietly. Calling someone to help. Ava slipped the phone back into her pocket. Not exactly. Outside, a service vehicle began moving across the wet tarmac toward the waiting aircraft. Neither of them noticed. Inside the terminal, the concierge behind the front desk suddenly looked down at her monitor. Her eyes widened. She blinked twice and checked the information again. Then she picked up a phone and spoke in a hurried whisper. Across the lounge, another employee received a notification and immediately straightened in his chair. One by one, small reactions began spreading through the private terminal like ripples across still water. Ryan remained completely unaware. "You know," he said, lowering his voice. "People cause problems when they try to be something they are not." Ava studied him carefully. There was no anger in her eyes. Only a quiet sadness, as if she had seen this exact moment many times before. "And sometimes," she said softly, "people reveal exactly who they are without realizing it." Before Ryan could respond, movement erupted near the far end of the terminal. Several staff members suddenly emerged from a restricted hallway, walking quickly in Ava's direction with expressions that suggested something very important had just changed. Ryan followed the movement instinctively. 3 employees in dark business attire were approaching quickly from the restricted corridor. Their pace was professional but urgent, the kind of urgency reserved for situations that could not be ignored. The woman leading them, a tall executive with a silver identification badge clipped to her blazer, scanned the terminal until her eyes landed on Ava. The moment she saw her, her expression changed completely. Relief, concern, respect, all at once. "Ms. Montgomery," she called as she crossed the marble floor. "We have been trying to locate you." The terminal seemed to freeze. Ava offered a polite smile. "Good morning, Grace." Ryan glanced between them. His confidence wavered for the first time. Grace Whitman, the lead flight attendant assigned to the private aircraft outside, stopped directly in front of Ava. "We were worried something had delayed your arrival," she said. "The crew is ready whenever you are." Several nearby passengers exchanged confused looks. One man slowly lowered his coffee cup. Another leaned forward in his seat. Ryan cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he interrupted, forcing authority back into his voice. "I am conducting a security review." Grace turned toward him. The warmth vanished from her face. "A security review?" "That is correct." Grace looked at Ava, then back at Ryan. "Of whom?" "Her." Silence followed. The kind of silence that becomes louder with every passing second. Ava remained calm, but she could see the realization beginning to spread through the room. Employees who had been watching discreetly now stared openly. Ryan could feel it too. Yet pride kept him from stepping back. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Grace chose her words carefully. "Officer, Ms. Montgomery has been cleared through this facility hundreds of times." Ryan frowned. "That does not change procedure." Before Grace could answer, another figure emerged from the restricted hallway. Daniel Brooks, director of private operations for the terminal. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor as he approached. Employees immediately straightened when they saw him. Daniel rarely left his office unless something required his personal attention. When he reached Ava, he extended his hand. "Ms. Montgomery, my apologies for the delay this morning." Ava shook his hand politely. "No delay, just an unexpected conversation." Daniel's eyes shifted toward Ryan. The meaning behind those words was impossible to miss. "I see." Ryan folded his arms. "Perhaps someone would like to explain what is happening." Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "You do not know?" Ryan felt heat rise into his face. "Know what?" For the first time since the encounter began, a faint smile appeared on Ava's face. Not a triumphant smile. Not a mocking one. Just the smile of someone who already knew how the story would end. Outside, beyond the rain-streaked glass, the engines of the white jet began preparing for departure. Inside the terminal, every eye remained fixed on Daniel Brooks as he took a slow breath, glanced toward the aircraft, and prepared to answer the question that was about to change everything. Daniel Brooks looked at Ryan for several seconds, almost as if he were giving him one final opportunity to connect the pieces himself. The opportunity passed. Ryan remained standing with his arms crossed, waiting for an explanation that he still believed would justify everything he had done. Around them, the terminal had become completely still. Employees who normally moved with practiced efficiency had paused their work. Travelers who had flights to catch suddenly seemed far more interested in the unfolding scene than the departure boards. Even the soft music playing through the lounge speakers felt distant. Daniel finally spoke. "Officer Keller, the aircraft you see outside belongs to Ms. Ava Montgomery." Ryan blinked. No one said a word. For a moment, the statement seemed too simple to process. "She is a passenger?" Ryan asked. Daniel slowly shook his head. "No," another silence. "She owns the aircraft." The words landed with the weight of a closing door. Across the terminal, several people exchanged stunned glances. One executive quietly lowered his phone. A woman near the concierge desk covered her mouth in disbelief. Ryan stared at Ava, waiting for her to deny it, to correct it, to say there had been some misunderstanding. She did neither. Ava simply stood there with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. The rain continued tapping against the glass beyond her shoulder. The engines outside continued their steady preparations. Nothing about her demeanor changed because she had never needed the reveal. Ryan was the only person who had. "That is not possible," he said quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "It is very possible." Ryan looked through the massive windows toward the jet. Suddenly, details he had ignored earlier began fitting together. The flight crew waiting near the aircraft. The urgency among terminal staff. The respectful way everyone addressed Ava. The realization spread through him piece by piece. "That aircraft is worth." He stopped himself. Daniel finished the thought. "A considerable amount." Ryan swallowed. For the first time all morning, certainty abandoned him. Ava took a slow breath and glanced toward the runway. "Money is not really the point," she said. Her voice was gentle, but every person listening heard it clearly. It never was. Ryan looked at her. "Then what is the point?" Ava turned toward him fully. The disappointment in her eyes felt heavier than anger ever could have. "The point is that you decided who belonged here before you knew anything about me." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ava continued. "You saw my face. You saw my skin. You saw what you expected to see. And after that, nothing else mattered." Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came. Because deep down, he knew exactly what she meant. And for the first time that morning, he also knew everyone else understood it too. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire terminal. Ryan Keller stood motionless, aware that every person in the room had heard Ava's words. Outside, the rain continued falling across the runway, washing the morning in shades of gray and silver. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that had existed only minutes earlier. The confidence Ryan had carried into the encounter was fading, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Reflection. Ava could see it happening. She had seen it before in boardrooms, conference halls, luxury hotels, and private terminals across the country. The details changed. The locations changed. The faces changed. But the pattern rarely did. People made decisions about her before hearing her speak, before learning her name, before understanding anything about her life. Daniel Brooks shifted his attention toward Ava. "Your flight crew has completed final preparations," he said respectfully. "Captain Carter is ready whenever you are." Ava nodded. "Thank you, Daniel." Grace Whitman smiled warmly. "The cabin is prepared exactly as requested." Ava returned the smile. "I appreciate that." Ryan listened carefully. Every sentence only reinforced what he now understood. These people were not pretending. They were not mistaken. Ava Montgomery was not simply a passenger moving through the terminal. She was someone whose presence mattered. Someone respected. Someone whose decisions influenced entire operations. Yet none of that seemed to impress Ava herself. What struck Ryan most was how ordinary she remained. She was not boasting. She was not demanding special treatment. She was not humiliating him in return. She simply stood there with dignity. And somehow that made the moment even harder. A middle-aged traveler sitting near the lounge finally spoke. "Ma'am, if you do not mind me asking, what do you do?" Several heads turned toward Ava. The question carried genuine curiosity. Ava paused briefly before answering. "I build aviation companies." A few eyebrows rose. "Started with one small charter aircraft 15 years ago," she continued. "Then another. Then another. Eventually we expanded into logistics, maintenance, pilot training, and private aviation services." The traveler nodded slowly. "That is impressive." Ava smiled politely. It took a long time. Ryan felt a knot forming in his stomach. 15 years. Thousands of hours. Countless obstacles. Achievements he had never bothered to imagine because he had already decided who she was the moment she walked through the door. The realization settled heavily on him. Not because she owned a jet, not because she was wealthy, but because he had never given her the opportunity to simply be herself. Across the terminal, employees resumed moving, though the energy felt different now. People were still watching, still thinking, still processing what had happened. Ava picked up her travel bag and glanced once more through the glass toward the aircraft waiting beyond the rain. Then she took a step forward. And as she did, Ryan understood something he had completely missed all morning. The most powerful thing about Ava Montgomery was never the airplane waiting outside. It was the fact that she had never needed anyone's permission to belong there. As Ava moved toward the private access corridor, nobody rushed to follow. The terminal seemed caught between two moments, the one that had existed before she arrived and the one that existed now. Ryan remained where he stood, watching her walk away. For the first time that morning, the badge on his uniform did not feel like an advantage. It felt like a responsibility he had failed to carry correctly. The sound of polished shoes crossing marble echoed softly through the lounge. Grace Whitman and Daniel Brooks accompanied Ava toward the secured entrance, speaking quietly about weather conditions and flight timing. The conversation was routine, professional, ordinary. Yet Ryan found himself paying attention to every word. He had expected power to look different, louder, more demanding, more interested in proving itself. Instead, Ava carried her success with the same calm dignity she had shown when he stopped her. Near the entrance, Daniel paused. "Ms. Montgomery, there is one more thing you should know." Ava turned. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated briefly. "The terminal records all security interactions. This morning's incident has already been flagged for review." Ava looked at him for a moment. "I see. Would you like us to proceed with a formal complaint?" Several employees nearby grew noticeably still. Even Ryan, standing nearly 30 feet away, could hear the question. It hung in the air like a crossroads. Ava could have answered immediately. She had every reason to. Instead, she looked through the glass wall toward the runway where the rain was finally beginning to ease. Thin streaks of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. The white jet gleamed beneath the changing sky. "No," she said quietly. Daniel looked surprised. "No." Ava shook her head. "A complaint will not change what happened." Grace studied her carefully. "Then what will?" Ava smiled faintly. "People choosing to learn from it." Across the terminal, Ryan lowered his eyes. The words reached him more directly than any criticism could have. He thought back to the first moment he saw her. How quickly he had formed assumptions. How confidently he had acted on them. How certain he had been without knowing a single fact. Imagine standing there and realizing the person you judged had spent years building companies, creating jobs, training pilots, and opening doors for others while you reduced them to a stereotype in a matter of seconds. That realization settled heavily inside him. Ava adjusted the strap of her travel bag and took another step toward the corridor. Before disappearing through the secure doorway, she paused and glanced back one final time. Her eyes briefly met Ryan's. There was no anger there. No triumph, no desire to embarrass him, only a quiet reminder that every person who walks through a door carries a story you cannot see. Then she turned and continued forward while, behind her, an entire terminal remained silent, each person left alone with the same uncomfortable question. How many times had they done exactly what Ryan Keller had done without ever realizing it? The secure door closed softly behind Ava, but the impact of her presence lingered long after she disappeared from view. Ryan Keller remained standing near the checkpoint, watching the empty corridor as though the answers he needed might somehow return through it. Around him, the terminal slowly resumed its rhythm. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. Travelers gathered their belongings. Yet something had changed. The people who had witnessed the exchange carried themselves differently now. Some appeared thoughtful, others uncomfortable. A few avoided looking in Ryan's direction altogether. Daniel Brooks remained near the entrance for a moment before turning toward the operations team. As he did, a notification appeared on his tablet. His expression tightened slightly. Grace Whitman noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel glanced toward the runway. The board reviewed the incident faster than expected. Grace understood what that meant. Large organizations moved slowly on most days, but moments that affected reputation had a way of accelerating everything. Across the terminal, Ryan noticed them speaking and felt a growing sense of unease. Not fear, something deeper. The realization that consequences do not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they arrive quietly, carried by emails, reports, and conversations behind closed doors. 10 minutes later, another airport executive entered the terminal. Her name was Melissa Harding, Regional Director of Operations. Employees straightened the moment they saw her. Melissa rarely visited the private terminal without a reason. She approached Daniel directly and exchanged a few brief words. Then she looked across the room toward Ryan. He knew immediately that the conversation involved him. Melissa walked over calmly. "Officer Keller." "Ma'am, I would like a word." Ryan nodded and followed her toward a private conference room overlooking the runway. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the white jet remained visible in the distance. Rain clouds were finally beginning to break apart. Sunlight reflected off the aircraft's polished exterior. Melissa closed the conference room door behind them. "Do you know who Ava Montgomery is?" she asked. Ryan hesitated. "A successful business owner." Melissa folded her hands. "She employs more than 3,000 people across 4 states. Her companies partner with airports, aviation schools, maintenance facilities, and community outreach programs. Last year alone, her scholarship foundation helped dozens of students pursue aviation careers." Ryan listened quietly. Every sentence revealed another layer he had never bothered to imagine. Melissa continued, "The issue is not that you questioned a passenger. The issue is why you chose that passenger." The room fell silent. Outside, a service vehicle guided the jet toward its departure position. Ryan looked through the glass and finally understood that the story had never been about wealth, status, or ownership. It was about assumptions. And sitting there in the reflection of the conference room window, he found himself facing the one person he had spent years avoiding. Himself. Thousands of feet above the clouds, Ava Montgomery sat beside the large oval window of her aircraft, watching sunlight spill across a blanket of white clouds stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The turbulence of the morning was already far behind her, yet the events at the terminal lingered in her thoughts. Not because she felt anger, not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew the experience was bigger than a single conversation between 2 strangers. In the conference room overlooking the runway, Ryan Keller remained seated long after Melissa Harding finished speaking. The silence between them felt heavier than any formal reprimand. Melissa was not interested in humiliating him. She was interested in making him understand. "The board has requested additional training and a review of passenger interaction procedures," she said calmly. "This is not about one mistake. It is about preventing the next one." Ryan nodded slowly. For perhaps the first time in his career, he stopped looking for excuses. He stopped searching for technicalities. He stopped convincing himself that intent mattered more than impact. Across the airport, conversations about the incident continued quietly among employees. Not because a wealthy passenger had been inconvenienced, not because someone owned a private jet, but because people had witnessed something uncomfortable and recognizable. Many of them had seen similar assumptions before. Some had experienced them personally. Others realized they had unknowingly participated in them. Later that afternoon, Melissa received an unexpected email. It came from Ava. The message was brief, professional, respectful. Ava thanked the airport staff who had treated her with dignity and praised the professionalism of the flight crew. There was no demand for punishment, no request for public consequences. At the bottom of the message was a single sentence. "Real change begins when people are given a chance to become better than they were yesterday." Melissa read the line twice before forwarding it to the executive team. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued westward through clear skies. Grace Whitman stopped by Ava's seat with a cup of tea and a warm smile. "You handled that situation better than most people would have." Ava accepted the cup. "Maybe." Grace tilted her head. "You could have made things much harder for him." Ava looked out the window again. Sometimes the lesson is already hard enough. The afternoon sun illuminated the cabin with a golden glow. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Below them, cities, highways, and airports passed by unnoticed. Lives intersecting, stories unfolding, people making judgments, people challenging them, people learning. Back in Atlanta, Ryan stood alone near the same glass wall where the morning had begun. The runway looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. And as another aircraft climbed into the sky, he finally understood something that no badge, title, or position could teach. Respect is not about deciding who belongs. It is about recognizing that dignity belongs to everyone before you know anything else about them. Weeks passed, but the morning at the terminal was not forgotten. Not by the employees who witnessed it, not by the executives who reviewed it, and certainly not by Ryan Keller. Change rarely arrives all at once. More often, it appears in small decisions repeated day after day until they become part of who someone is. Ryan began noticing things he had overlooked before. The nervous traveler standing alone at a counter. The elderly passenger struggling with directions. The young entrepreneur carrying nothing but a laptop and a dream. People he might once have reduced to assumptions now became individuals with stories he could not see. Meanwhile, Ava Montgomery continued building the life she had spent years creating. Her companies expanded into new markets. More students entered aviation programs through her scholarship foundation. More pilots completed training. More careers were launched. Yet if anyone asked her about success, she rarely mentioned aircraft, contracts, or business growth. She spoke about opportunity. She spoke about opening doors. She spoke about making sure someone else's path was a little easier than her own had been. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the incident, a letter arrived at her office. It was simple, handwritten, honest. Ava opened it and immediately recognized the signature at the bottom. Ryan Keller. The message was not long. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses. He simply thanked her. Thanked her for choosing dignity instead of humiliation. Thanked her for teaching a lesson that could not have been learned from a training manual. And thanked her for reminding him that respect must come before judgment. Ava read the letter quietly and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she returned to work. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not public. They are not celebrated by crowds. They happen inside a human heart when a person finally chooses to become better. Back in Atlanta, another rainy morning arrived at the airport. Travelers moved through the terminal just as they always had. Flights departed. Flights landed. Life continued. Ryan stood near the same checkpoint where everything had begun. A woman approached carrying a worn backpack and a boarding pass. She looked uncertain, lost. For a brief second, the old habit tried to return. The quick judgment, the easy assumption. Then he remembered. He stepped forward with a genuine smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" The woman smiled back with visible relief. It was a small moment, almost invisible, yet it mattered, because that is how real change begins. Not with power, not with wealth, not with status, but with a choice. A choice to see people before stereotypes. A choice to value dignity before assumptions. And somewhere high above the clouds, another aircraft crossed the endless blue sky, carrying a woman who never needed revenge because the greatest form of justice had already happened. Someone finally learned to see.